Next up, I'd like to welcome Mason Cosby. Mason specializes in building scrappy ABM programs on low budgets that drive high impact. Serving as the marketing lead at numerous boutique bootstrap businesses, Mason has sourced over $6 million in the past 3 years, driving an 18x ROI. Additionally, Mason is the strategist and producer behind 5 podcasts that consistently rank in the top 30 of their category, including mine. And if you're looking for no-nonsense practical marketing execution that drives revenue, Mason can guide practical, low-tech ways for growth. Thank you so much for being here today.
Bree, always excited to chat with you, and Todd, Morgan, always pumped to chat with you guys too. So thanks for having me.
Welcome, welcome.
So I've heard you say there are only 3 types of podcasts. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think a lot of people love to start a podcast and they just kind of wander aimlessly. For context, that's what I did for about a year with a show called The Marketing Ladder. Had no strategy, no plan, didn't know what I was doing, and just kept doing it because it was fun. But in the context of a B2B tech organization or someone that's trying to generate a lot of revenue, the goal being fun is not necessarily something that CMOs approve of. So there are 3 core kinds of podcasts that every B2B organization is running. So one is the content engine. That one's fairly self-explanatory. We can dig a little bit more into that. The next is account-based podcasting, which is what I thought ScrapAB was going to specialize in. But now, having blown up a fair number of shows in the past 6 months, the last one is public figure podcasting. So building an audience using a podcast channel. So those are the 3 types. And if you're not running one of those 3 types, I challenge you to really think through the strategy because I don't think there are any other kinds of podcasts.
So can you elaborate a bit more on the content engine podcast?
Yeah, so the content engine, if you think about how we create really any form of content, generally speaking, it starts with some kind of subject matter expertise and some form of an interview. In the context of a content engine, the goal is instead of just doing an interview, again, when I was starting with blog content, I would just interview an SME on a Zoom call, press record, get the transcript, and that was it. Instead, we upload it to Spotify and Apple, and it becomes the input device through which we capture incredible information and then post-produce it. So again, think about the context. Alex Lieberman's here with StoryArt. They do ghostwriting for executives, but they have to get the initial input information. So the podcast becomes your input that then translates into written form content. It translates into social clips that can then be distributed. You can upload it to YouTube. YouTube is making a massive play in the podcast space to try to overtake Apple and Spotify. So huge opportunities there. And the other thing is, down the road, if you end up building a great show, invite your customers on. Have them tell their stories. That becomes case study content and sales enablement. It's a huge opportunity if you view recording a podcast as the input device for all post creation, because at some point you've got to capture the information in the first place. You're just pressing record, uploading it to Spotify and Apple, and then actually building an audience around that channel.
So can a podcast be more than one? Could I have a content engine that's also a public figure podcast?
It's a great question. Inevitably you can, but the challenge with that is I just think that people can only focus on one thing.
Sure.
So prime example, there's a podcast that I run that most people know is with Jay Schwedelson. It's called Do This, Not That. Again, it's consistently been the top 20 for the marketing category, and we launched it in August. That is largely a public figure podcast, but out of that, we do create content. Occasionally, we do actually invite some of his target accounts onto the show. So those things are also accomplished, but the main metric of success is audience growth. The main metric that we say, this is how we know we're winning, is the growth of the audience, the engagement of that audience, and then inevitably continuing to build his own media business. And he runs a media company. So again, that's the main metric of success. Yes, do we generate sponsorship revenue? Absolutely. Yes, do we generate target account relationships? Absolutely. Yes, do we create a lot of content out of it? Absolutely. But when I report to Jay, whether we're winning or losing, it's audience growth. It's nothing else.
Interesting. So how do you choose one or the other?
Yeah, I think it's largely dependent on your organization and who you are. So we'll start with the easiest to disqualify out of would be public figure podcasting. We've talked about these shows that are the top 5. Again, we've got Bree, and Bree's got about 250,000 followers on LinkedIn and an email list of about 100,000 people. You have a great audience that exists. We've got Scott Jeffrey Miller, former CMO of Franklin Covey. We've got Daniel Disney with 1.1 million followers on LinkedIn. We've got Jay Schwedelson that's got 2 shows, and he's got a massive audience between LinkedIn and email. What you're hearing in that is they have existing audiences that they've now taken out of sometimes owned channels like email, and they're transitioning them into an audience that provides greater depth. So again, I love social, I love email, but there is something about hearing a person's voice. There's something about understanding their even thought process that creates audience depth that cannot be accomplished through a written format. So public figure podcasting in a lot of ways is taking casual consumers and turning them to deep raving fans. So if you don't have the existing casual consumers and audience, public figure podcasting is not the place to start. Whereas it might be the content engine, it might be account-based podcasting.
So, first and foremost, good to see you, Mason.
Good to see you too.
First thing, this is completely off topic. When I saw you launch Scrap ABM, I was really hoping it was gonna be like a mixtape you were gonna drop. like that's what I thought. I was like, oh, this is about to be heat. And I was like, all right, you're starting on company, fantastic. But let's talk about like the podcast a little bit more. How should one go about the production?
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's probably the huge hang up. Like, okay, I gotta get a camera, a mic. Like, I gotta go talk to. I don't know what to do. So what should you do there?
Yeah, I think something that's been talked about probably a lot today is validation before overinvestment.
Yep.
So my first podcast was started with a laptop, and that was it. So like I had my webcam, I had my crappy laptop microphone. If you go back and listen to the Marketing Ladder, the first 13 episodes were absolutely terrible, like horrible garbage. I mean, just confirm.
I'm gonna go listen.
The sound quality was terrible. I didn't know what I was doing.
Deleted it from Spotify.
It was just bad. But I started to feel the momentum. And I put it this way.
Yeah.
We'll talk about how this turns into account-based podcasting. The booking rate on a podcast on average is 80%.
Yeah.
So I, just having a podcast, was able to invite people that would have no context for who I was.
Yeah.
And they said yes 4 out of 5 times.
Yeah.
4 out of 5.
Yeah.
So if we think about, sorry, I get really excited about this. But if
That's what we asked you.
but like if we think about just other outbound methods, you're lucky for cold to get like a 5%, like lucky to get 5%.
If that.
So we're talking cold outbound to highly influential individuals. You're looking at 80% booking rate.
Yeah.
So again, starting there, you don't need to overcomplicate it. Just start recording, and then once you've validated, okay, this is working, I'm starting to feel the movement. And I want to be clear, early it's a feeling. And largely it's, these people even know that I exist now.
Yeah.
It's impossible for somebody to buy from you if they don't know that you exist.
100%.
Yeah.
So podcasting and account-based podcasting is a way that you can make people aware that you exist. Once you started to validate it, you can buy more things. My first, actually still my microphone, I turn it sideways intentionally. It's actually a World of Warcraft microphone that was a limited edition that I bought on a Black Friday. It's a $200 microphone that I bought for $100.
Don't ever change it.
No, of course not. But it's a great microphone, and I found it on sale. So again, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. Just get started, and I know that that's an advice that a lot of people say, but in all seriousness, get started, prove out the model, and then then start to invest in the equipment.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into this. I might be butchering the stat, but I believe like 83% of podcasts stop after the 5th episode. I think it's
It's actually worse. 90% stop after the 3rd episode.
Okay, so so the things people will see this stat, and they're like, okay, I don't want to start because like I don't want to get into it. You do 3 episodes, no inbounds coming in, no one's liking it. So we talked about, obviously, you want to validate it. We talked about the metrics. Like, let's talk about like the mentality of it and like the emotional piece of this on how do you keep going and how do you make sure that you are just continuously putting out the content.
Yeah, so in the context, I think unless you're someone that has an existing following, public figure podcasting, though massively beneficial, is not going to be relevant for most people. So let's talk about content engine and target account, account-based podcasting. Again, in the context of a content engine, the goal is content output. So you don't look necessarily early on at how many downloads did I get? Do I have a growing audience? Is the content, honestly, to get it started, is it even good? Bree knows, because, again, I'm helping her produce her show. I don't actually provide very much feedback until episode 13, because the first 13 episodes largely are you finding the groove.
Why did you pick 13?
Generally, that's where most people, that's the second cutoff.
Okay.
So 90% will fail after episode 3, an additional 90% will fall off after episode 13.
Cool.
So again, when we look at those metrics, we were joking about it before we recorded. I hopped up here and started, Morgan, you said I was gassing everybody up, but like that's actually my job. Yeah. In the context of helping somebody get a show off the ground, I gas them up. I encourage them.
You have to.
And then when we hit episode 13, they're bought in enough that we can start to then optimize the content and optimize the show. Yeah. So it's, in a content engine, it's content production and how many content assets am I developing that then reach a wider audience. In the context of an account-based podcast, it's target account relationships. Yeah. So prime example, I have a closing call Friday with a target account that came on the Marketing Ladder 3 years ago. Yeah. Like CMO that would have no context for who I am, and it was the relationship. And again, there is fewer ABM programs you can build for $32 a month.
Yeah.
So in that context, it's the recognition that it's the long-term relationships that will inevitably pay off.
So I got a quick question. So we all know that a lot of podcasts fail. We just went over the stats. You said you don't give much feedback until after episode 13. So for someone who is starting and you're not going over a specific podcast right now, once you do get to episode 13, what's like some common advice that you typically give people?
It's largely content structure. So again, how are you asking questions? How do you engage with a guest? I remember at Marketing Ladder days, I had a guest that talked for an hour and 15 minutes, and I asked him 3 questions. I had no idea how to rein in a guest, and that's very difficult when you do a guest-based podcast.
Yeah.
And honestly, please don't go back and listen too much, but it just like it wasn't a good episode. And I didn't feel comfortable not releasing content because I had a guest, I took their time. But now I'm way more comfortable saying to a host, like, that episode was not good. Here's what you could have done better, and we're not going to release this episode. Because at the end of the day, the guests will come and go. It's your show. It continues to build your brand. So if you produce bad content and release bad content, that doesn't reflect on the guest, it reflects on you.
Yep.
I know a fairly well-known podcaster that whenever they have a very bad episode or a guest that, like you said, just rambles or doesn't have a good talk, their go-to is to say that the files were corrupted.
I'm putting that in my back pocket. I love that.
Files are hey, look, you can't.
Sorry.
My bad.
It happens.
Here's the feedback. Maybe we'll do it again.
I love it.
Well, Mason.
Files are corrupted, but 50 things you did wrong.
If you say that to me after I record some episodes, I'll get it.
Now we know.
For context, I did accidentally delete an episode of
Yeah,
Threes last week.
We'll talk about that later. I believed you, but we'll talk about it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mason.
Absolutely.
You're an icon, and this was great chatting with you.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We'll be back.